Tom Fox and Kyle Brasseur return to look at top Compliance Week stories from September, what's coming up in October, talk some sports, and generally solve the world's problems. Hello, everyone. This is Tom Fox, and welcome to From the Editor's Desk, a podcast where we unpack some of the top stories which have or will appear in Compliance Week, look at the top compliance stories, talk some sports, and generally try to solve the world's problems. I'm your co-host, Tom Fox.
And I'm Kyle Brasseur, Editor-in-Chief at Compliance Week. And Tom and I are back from a short hiatus to catch up. We'll talk a little bit about what's going on at Compliance Week. We'll talk some sports. And hey, maybe we just might save the world this one.
I'm thinking that that is on tap. But maybe we could start with, it's certainly been a little while, but what were some of the top stories that you or your team saw and wrote about in September, realizing it's the end of the fiscal year for the federal government?
Yeah, and I'm glad we're doing this recording here on that first day after, because it's always a whirlwind at the end. You know, that last day of the government fiscal year. You know, we're really in reaction mode with a lot of the enforcement actions coming through, and I think one of the ones that I'm sure that I know you come prepared to talk about is that Albemarle FCPA settlement. I posted about this on my LinkedIn. There were two things that really stuck with me from that settlement. One was the reference from the DOJ. It's the first time I've seen them break down the discount that a company was able to earn under its compensation clawback pilot program that launched in March. And then the second is the DOJ and the SEC both acknowledging Albemarle's use of data analytics to improve their compliance program as a remedial factor. This to me just really stood out, even more so than the monetary total, because it had a huge impact on the monetary total. I mean, Albemarle got a 45% reduction, I do believe, on their criminal penalty because of the efforts that they've undertaken. So, that's on that. I think it's fresh, but it's that type of story that compliance officers are always looking for to get an idea as to how the DOJ is doing the things that they say they're doing, because they're not going to give you that more guidance. They're going to tell you, look at the enforcements.
Right. Well, there's a couple of things. I'm actually in the middle of writing my multi-blog post series on that enforcement action, but a couple of things struck me early. The first was the lack of self-disclosure and indeed a significant period of waiting and investigating before turning over the information to the DOJ, and that it was unclear, of course, from the settlement documents, but it looked like the company, after an initial suspicion around Vietnam, found significant other places where corruption was going on. And the second was, I'm a complete sentencing amount geek. And I go through all of the factors and try to figure that out. We did not have that. We did have, as you said, the discounts that were given for the FCPA corporate enforcement policy, but under the sentencing guidelines, there's a Byzantine formula for setting the range of fines and penalties, and that was not present. So I was a little disappointed in that. But I think at the end of the day, the company came off pretty well because of the factors you mentioned, Kyle, which were, in addition, extensive cooperation, extensive remediation, no monitor required, although CCO certification is required. And as you also noted correctly, the not clawbacks, but bonuses not paid, and a significant amount of bonuses. And I thought that was something that we should all note and talk about going forward, because the DOJ, I think, really gave them a lot of credit for that. So, that was a big one in a year where we don't have too many big ones. It's a lot of lessons learned, and I'm sure compliance will be unpacking that as you and your team take a deep dive into it going forward.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it's still fresh, like you said. I think we're still looking for a little bit more documentation from the DOJ if they'll provide it. It's always inconsistent as to how much ends up coming through, but we know how valuable these cases are as reference points to compliance officers, because again, whenever anyone's asked the DOJ for guidance, they say, well, you get guidance when we take an enforcement action. That's your guidance right there. We're really looking at it, but I think it's interesting, and that, like you said, it's been a slow year from that perspective. There were a few that have trickled in over the last several months. Obviously, there was the Clear Channel one over at the SEC that also came through. if not last week, then the week before. But it's definitely always opens our eyes when those cases come through to really kind of break things down. And it seems like there's been several this year that have really been hyper focused on books and records. So there's always a lot to be learned from that because that's not going anywhere anytime soon. And those violations are fairly frequent.
There's one data point I want to put out there to see if maybe you would want to take a deeper dive. But something I'm going to note was the Vietnam component. And I say that because I think many U.S. companies are thinking about how can they de-risk or decouple themselves, two terms I've come across recently in China. And Vietnam is certainly one of the countries in Asia Pacific they're looking towards. And I'm beginning to wonder, is Vietnam moving towards a high risk for corruption country that U.S. companies need to be aware of and perhaps put more protections in? But I was intrigued by that a little bit, and I'm going to go back and see if I can take a look at some of the enforcement actions involving Vietnam to see where that might take us as well.
Yeah, absolutely. I think it's always interesting to sort of understand those trickle effects that extend beyond the usual players or what have you. And then I think for the rest of it, a lot of it was I would say a little predictable. Like I felt like there was going to be another wave of penalties under from the FCC regarding off-channel communications, and that was indeed the case. This one was mostly focused on broker-dealers and investment advisors as opposed to the big banks like the first wave was. And then the other standout for us was there was a case that FinCEN, FDIC, and NYDFS all settled with Shinhan Bank, who's actually based in South Korea, their American affiliate. So, end of fiscal year, it was interesting from an enforcement perspective, and I think there's a lot for us to dive into over these next couple of weeks to really start to figure out, well, okay, what are the deeper stories beyond the surface level of some of these press releases and what the real takeaways are. And one more actually too was the Deutsche Bank affiliate that settled with the SEC over essentially allegations that they were greenwashing. There's a lot of people paying attention to that as the SEC gets ready to maybe one day finalize its climate-related disclosure rule. People think maybe October, so we'll see what ends up happening. But all eyes on those sort of topics and what's going on there.
So Deutsche Bank, in my world, the gift that keeps giving and never stops. But I'm glad you mentioned Shinhan Bank because I was intrigued for a couple of reasons about that enforcement action. I really look forward to what you guys take a deep dive into. One was, as you mentioned, the number of regulators involved in that action, particularly the DFS or Department of Financial Services from the state of New York. But also the allegations were really failure to have an effective compliance program. They did mention that money laundering or other nefarious activity could have occurred and suspicious activity was not reported, but the real focus seemed to be on the lack of an effective compliance program. And that's sort of an affirmative enforcement that we typically don't see.
Yeah, and I would say it was even, and this just sort of based off the details provided by the agencies, the lack of interest in having an effective compliance program, because the bank had been warned through several consent orders that it needed to improve its program. And I think the consent orders dated back to as far as 2015 was when they were first sort of put on their radar. They reached a consent order with FDIC in 2017, and then they had an amended consent order with FDIC, and then they had a consent order with NYDFS. And so at that point, you start to wonder, you've been warned about this for years at the time. When are you going to go ahead and address it? And I think that was really the spirit of the fine was, okay, if you're not going to take this seriously, then we're going to force you to take it seriously with a financial penalty, and one that involved a lot of moving parts and pieces. And so, I think it's definitely an interesting story, and one that we're looking at closer is, I think it's the same thing, like you said. It's not so much that these things occurred, but it's just that the program was really not designed to even remotely prevent it from occurring if it did happen. And you give some credit to the company for admitting that they went wrong in their consent order with FinCEN, but it certainly seems like the regulators had to sort of crack the whip to get the bank to take it seriously.
Kyle, Compliance Week also had its annual virtual ESG event conference. And I was wondering if you might say a few words about that event this year.
Yeah, absolutely. I think the timing of it was sort of precarious in that, we're still waiting for the SEC to finalize its climate related disclosure rules. So, last year's conference was all about it because it was sort of fresh and new. And then this year's conference is, well, what's going on? Nothing's really changed since then. But I think the main message this year was, hey, we're still waiting on this, and maybe some changes are going to come as a result of that tens of thousands of comments the SEC received. But at the end of the day, you still have to start getting ready for this, because if it's not the SEC, then somebody else is going to require it. And the main law that was pointed to is the CSRD in the European Union. They have requirements for Scope 3 disclosures, and so even if you're let off the hook from an SEC, if you're a large company with a presence in Europe, you have to do these things anyway. So that was really, I think, the prevailing discussion point was, don't wait for this. You need to start getting ahead of this, because the requirements are coming one way or another. And even if they're not coming from a regulatory perspective, they're going to come from an investor perspective. And that's what the investors are looking for. I think that a lot of businesses have sort of picked up on that. But it was great in terms of, I think, rehashing some of these concepts that companies might be confronting for the first time. A couple stood out to me is the idea of commissioning a materiality assessment. I've heard from a lot of folks that that's just a great starting point. When you're trying to confront climate-related or ESG-related disclosures for the first time. So always good to get pointers on that. And then I think the ending point, the other end of the life cycle, is the assurance. And that's something that companies are going to have to go through a lot for the first time, is getting that outside third party to assure to the data that you're finding. You can't, that's not something you jump into a couple months in. It takes a lot of work to get to the point of feeling confident enough to have everything assured and sign off. Because once it's assured, there's no going back. That certification is what it is. So I think it was really great to get a little bit more insight into those parts of the process, because companies are either confronting it for the first time right now, or they're going to be confronting it for the first time soon. Because like it or not, these rules are coming.
Kyle, I talk to a lot of compliance officers and other business executives around these issues, and they echo what I think some of the key highlights you brought forward, which is that this is not coming, it's already here. And it's here in the European context, but it's even more here from the business context, in terms of investor, in terms of private equity, in terms of banks, in terms of insurance companies. And companies are putting programs in place on literally scope 1, scope 2, and scope 3 right now, regardless of what the SEC has done or has not done yet. And if they do come out with regulations similar to what they've originally proposed, and even if there are attacks on those as oversteps by the SEC, those business practices are now largely in place, particularly with international organizations.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think one interesting sort of thing that was shared in one of those sessions is we had someone who was a speaker from a company that has a largely diversified portfolio. But one of the aspects of their business is utilizing coal energy, and the rest of the business and everything else the business accomplishes is completely overshadowed by that one aspect of the business. It doesn't matter how much you're doing, you have that one aspect that's you're linked to, and people hone in on that. And that's the reality that we're dealing with, sort of from a corporate risk perspective and the investor perspective. Is even if you have one area of the business that might be sort of giving off a little bit of the stink from that perspective, that's what people are going to focus on, and it's tough. You can be doing everything else A+ across the board, but that's going to be held against you. So it really is a matter of don't wait around for this. Don't think that anything's going to change with the SEC. You got to start acting on this stuff now, because it is like you said, it's here already.
Can I maybe ask you to turn to October? You've told us about some of the stories that started in September. You're going to explore perhaps a little more deep dive basis, but are there any other stories you're working on that may come out in October? And I'm going to ask you to save Inside the Mind of the CEO, because I want to talk about that specifically. But what are some of the things you and your team are working on for October?
Yeah, well, I think one of our main focuses is really off-channel communications right now. So like I said, there was another wave of penalties regarding that topic. It's something we've heard a lot about from our financial services readers, but also our non-financial services readers, because the DOJ is now paying attention to that. in its investigations. Not that they weren't before, but they sort of have specified very clearly that that's something that they're taking into consideration. So companies that maybe necessarily didn't need to have the most robust policies in that area are now starting to feel like they need to. And it is an impossible topic to wrap your head around. The idea of being able to track what all your employees are doing in terms of their business communications, while also being mindful of privacy laws and anything else that might be going on. So it's just something that we find to be so nuanced and complicated. So we do have something in the works right now that we're hoping to publish in October that kind of takes a deep dive, on the topic and really what some of the best practices are. But at the end of the day, nothing's perfect, and nobody's really perfected this because there is always just so many variables that are in play, and especially for businesses with a large geographic footprint, because there are some countries, where the primary form of communication is not email, it's not text, it is WhatsApp, or it is WeChat, or it is Signal, or any of these platforms. And so you're just up against it, I think, from a natural perspective of this is what people use on a day-to-day basis to communicate. So that's a topic that we really are trying to focus on and dive into. Some of the other things we have coming in October is we have our Europe event that's taking place. So that one's going to be in London in the middle of October. It'll be a really good opportunity to dive into a lot of the changes that are going on, not just in Europe, but also in the UK. One session that I'm going to be moderating down there that I think is going to be a really interesting discussion is, a breakdown of the sort of anti-money laundering landscape in the United Kingdom. There's a lot of laws and regulations and proposals that are sort of up in the air right now that could really change, a regulation perspective there. One of which is the Economic Crime and Transparency Bill that would require, or it would give Companies House more power to become an AML regulator. So now you're just talking about another cook in the kitchen for AML enforcement. So I think it's going to be really interesting to dive into that. We're also going to be talking CSRD, talking about whistleblower directive, talking about AI, all these things that we're really kind of starting to wrap our head around in the US. Europe's a little bit ahead of us with some of the laws that they have on the books. So, I think it's really always interesting for me to be able to get that exposure to these people who are sort of confronting it in the moment already, because, it could be that 2 or 3 years down the road, US is sort of following suit.
So now let me turn to something that puts a big smile on both of our faces, Kyle, and that is inside the mind of the CCO. You're starting to gather information on that. Can you remind our listeners what this survey is, how you go about collecting the information, and frankly, why it's so both popularly well received, but also critically well received across the compliance community?
Yeah, for us, I mean, this is our most important project that we undertake each year, because it really gives us a firm grip on what the compliance conversation is in the moment, and really being able to compare it to previous years that we've conducted it. So this is the 5th year that we've done this survey. I know that the title sounds like a little bit of a gatekeeper in a sense. We're not just looking for CCOs. We're looking for all compliance practitioners, those who are junior level, who aspire to be a CCO. Your input in this survey is just as important. And it's really just a great opportunity for us to get a pulse on the compliance industry at a given moment in time. And we do conduct this each year. We compare the results year over year to where things stand. Some of the questions that we're asking are sort of that fundamental year over year benchmarking. We're looking for salary information, education levels, where compliance is reporting at the business, all those things that sort of have a little bit of variation to them. But also really trying to take a deep dive into what keeps compliance officers up at night. Where are the focus areas on this given year? Maybe we find that this year data privacy is a little higher up that list now that we've got 5 state laws taking effect and 7 more in the can. It really gives us, I think, a really good view on where the compliance headaches are at the moment, or where the compliance opportunities are. And every year we do the survey, we really focus on the year over year benchmarking, because that gives us a bit of a sort of progression over time. But we do also tailor the survey each year to the unique conversation of that year. And so one of the way we broke it down this year is we have 3 individual sections, one of which is on off-channel communications, like I spoke about, one of which is on AI and new applications of AI, particularly generative AI. and the other one is on climate-related disclosures. And then we've talked about that, comparing between the SEC and the CSRD. We did ask some questions on climate disclosures last year, but we do feel it still is top of mind enough to really compare where people are at last year compared to this year. Again, for us, it's really just a great opportunity to get a read on our audience. We invest a lot of time and effort into putting this survey together, analyzing the results, coming up with stories off the results, but then also informing our coverage for the year ahead based on those results. So really excited to be able to launch that. Typically, the survey stays live up and through until late October, and then we close it. We start to analyze the results, and then in November or December, we typically start to publish all of our coverage off of the survey. So it's always a really exciting time for us because it's really our best way to get a really firm grip on what is top of mind for the compliance officer at this given moment.
So let's turn to the world of sports and see what we can come up with. I'm going to try not and gloat too much, but I'll gloat a little. And we're going to start with MLB. Obviously, the Astros won the division again, winning on the last game of the season as the beloved Texas Rangers completely collapsed, losing 3 or 4 to the even worse and more lowly Seattle Mariners. So there you are. The world is as it should be. You, on the other hand, have had one of the greatest 15, maybe 20-year runs of sports city history ever. And it's not at an end because the Celtics, I think, are perhaps even more relevant now. But where do you see maybe the baseball playoffs now that you have a little more distance and are not a part of it? I have to first shout out to the Baltimore Orioles. I never saw this coming as the best record in the American League, and even the Tampa Bay Rays. Any thoughts kind of one way or the other, or you just put the whole thing behind you and have no comment?
A little column A, a little column B. No, I mean, I think for us in Boston, it's I don't think the expectations were overly high this year. I think a lot of things have sort of happened that I think people wanted to see happen. I think you can blame it on Chaim Bloom as much as you'd like, but he is gone at this point, and I know that the fans here never really saw him as the best fit for the person who's sort of making the personnel decisions on the team. But I think for me as an individual, and I've said this on previous podcasts that we've done over the years, I like to see new teams in the mix. So I know that to people, it's shocking that both the Red Sox and the Yankees aren't in the playoff field. I think it's a great thing. I love to see a little bit of parity in the sports. I like to see teams that you didn't expect to make it. And I think this year's playoffs is just stock full of teams that I had no expectations for going into the year. I know the Orioles showed some stuff last year, but I certainly didn't think that they would be the best team in the NFL. I certainly wasn't expecting the Texas Rangers to be as good as they were. Arizona Diamondbacks, Miami Marlins. There's just so many teams that really kind of caught me off guard this year. And I think that makes for an exciting playoffs to be able to just see new teams, new players, some of these people who haven't made it before, who don't take it for granted. I think it's really going to be exciting. And so, I'm not actively rooting against the Astros, but they've been in the playoffs now for the last several years. So, if they lose, I won't lose too much sleep over it. I'm sorry, Tom. I like to see new teams in the mix. It's fun for me.
Before we leave baseball, could we both say a few words about Tim Wakefield, who we lost, I guess, yesterday? What did he mean to you? What did he mean to Boston? And I'll kind of take it from there.
Yeah, it's a tough loss for Boston. This is a city that really appreciates the players that really are the ones that are just consummate professionals, and they work hard at their craft and what they do. And that was very much Tim Wakefield defined. And he was with the Red Sox for a long time and was never the type of person to put himself first. Always put the team first, always put the community first, always put the fan base first. And that loss hurts. It hurts significantly, especially at such a young age. So, it was shocking. I know when I got an email yesterday about it, I was like, oh my goodness, that happened so quick. I think we had first sort of started to hear about it, him being sick last week. And it's a big loss. It's a tough one. And I think it's it's a testament to him and his character. And, it extended a lot beyond what he did on the field. He was still broadcasting over here, still involved in the community, still, I think, lived in Massachusetts. I think it's one that it's tough because it happened on the last day of the season. You really couldn't pay it that proper respect. But it's one that's going to carry over into next year. And I think you're going to find opening day next year, the Red Sox will most likely make it a point to really recognize Tim Wakefield because he meant so much to this team and to this community. And that's most definitely going to be, I think, a deserved recognition of everything that he accomplished and just what he meant as a person.
So for those who don't know, Tim Wakefield was one of the, if not the premier knuckleball pitchers in the first decade and a half of this century. I think he had 18 years. I'm going to talk about him in the context of a huge difficult moment and how he bounced back and showed some of the grit that Kyle talked about on the last pitch of the playoff game between the Red Sox and Yankees in 2003. Aaron Boone hit a home run while Tim Wakefield was that pitcher. And I've always wondered how he felt, what he felt. And every picture you see of Aaron Boone circling the bases, you see Tim Wakefield walking off the field. The only other pitcher I can think of that had that sort of impact or had that happen to him was when the Giants and the Dodgers played in 1951, and Ralph Branca gave up his shot heard around the world. But Tim Wakefield came back and was an integral part of the 04 curse-breaking, pennant-winning Boston Red Sox. And I always admired him for that. There's a lot of other reasons to admire him. He had one game, a 10-inning game. He threw 170 pitches. Unheard of. And he was still throwing into his 40s. And he played for numerous teams. But I always admired him for those 2 years and really those two events. And I thought that really spoke about his character. And he will be missed, I think, across Major League Baseball. Now let's turn to perhaps an equally disappointing subject for you this year, the NFL. And I guess the things that surprised me is I had thought the AFC would be the dominant conference. I'm not sure that's true. Some of the teams that I thought would be in the mix are 0-4 or 1-3 right now, or not very good, 2-2. And I'll leave the Patriots out for a little special talk about them. But what do you see that may have surprised you, at least at this point, Kyle?
I mean, I won't leave the Patriots out. I think that we're recording this on October 2nd, and your Dallas Cowboys just gave them an absolute smackdown. It's been surprising from a lot of angles, though. I mean, I think even the teams that maybe their records are performing well, the performance on the field hasn't quite been there. I think of the Chiefs as a prime example. They haven't been just completely dominating every single game that they're in, like they're capable of doing. So there's definitely been, I think, some kind of, surprises to some extent. And like you said, and there maybe was an expectation that the AFC would be a powerhouse this year with the Bills, with the Chiefs, with the Bengals. And I do think that there's been a little bit of missteps early in the season, especially with the Bengals. But I think we're 4 games in at this point. I think that's always really a good barometer because it's about a quarter of the season. So you start to really understand who the players are. And I know that one of the teams that's really shined and has really kind of, I think, surprised everyone is just how good the 49ers have been. I know they were in the playoffs and have made deep playoff runs these last several years, but I think just the difference that Christian McCaffrey's making there is just absolutely insane. The running back that they acquired from the Panthers last year. So they've been really exciting to watch. Eagles have been just as good as I think we all expected them to be. Some of the teams that are underachieving, like I mentioned, the Bengals are really the first one that comes to mind. That's why they play. And that's why, these early season games are so important because you don't want to find yourself in that hole that you have to dig out of. So it'll be interesting to sort of see where it continues to go. I imagine some of these teams are going to really start to settle in. I think I want to say in year 2 of the shortened preseason. And I know that it's something that I feel like some people are still shaking off rust around. So it'll be interesting to see where it goes. But I would say people are not very optimistic here in New England that is going to get much better. I think the conversation here is not so much how do we turn it around, but who is going to turn it around. Because we are officially in quarterback controversy mode here in Boston.
So I guess one of the things that certainly surprised me is the regression of Mac Jones, because I thought after his first year, he showed some real inklings and glimmer of talent that he could take up to a much higher level. I don't think that's happened. But let me ask you about Bill Belichick, greatest coach in the history of the NFL. Is it time? Should we have that conversation? How do you shake out on that?
Yeah, I think it's tough to tell. I always think Belichick should be judged by how well the defense is doing, just because I know that that's his sort of focus area. He's never really been an offensive minded coach. He's always sort of been known for getting the most out of his defense and getting the most out of who were essentially role players on other teams. And that defense has not been playing well this year. I think a lot of the games the Patriots have been in, they've been playing from behind very early. So that's where you start to sort of question it a little bit. I think Bill's the type of guy who's pretty much got a lifetime pass to sort of do what he wants up here. I imagine the leash on him is as long as it could possibly be on any coach, because no one seems to sort of question the overall pedigree. But he is into his 70s now, and you do start to sort of wonder, okay, what's the best thing for this franchise moving forward? And that I think just might end up being the conversation if the Patriots do have a year where they are, let's say, 4-13, or they have that really tilted losing record. I think we are going to start to have that serious conversation of, okay, is the end here for Bill, and it will be on his terms. I think he's earned that. I think he deserves that, and I think the Crafts will give him that, the owners of the Patriots. But it's really going to be interesting and telling to see where the rest of the season goes. Again, I'm focused on the defense. I think if the defense really doesn't work things out, then you start to have a real serious issue where it needs to be questioned for sure.
Kyle, let's conclude with a few words on the NBA. The season has not yet started, but last week there was a blockbuster trade with Portland sending Dame Lillard to Milwaukee. And there was fallout yesterday, I think, with Jrue Holiday being traded to the Celtics. The Celtics had a very interesting summer getting Porzingis and now Holiday. I'm a huge defensive fan, so Jrue Holiday is one of my favorite players in the league. Does he replace Marcus Smart, and does his addition give the Celtics really even more options now?
Yeah, and I think in reading a little bit about the trade yesterday, it certainly is exciting. When you look at it on paper, you have to imagine the Celtics have probably one of the most talented dynamic rotations in the game right now. A lot of it will be, the question will be, well, what's the depth behind it? And that's always the question when you do have a team that's very front loaded like that. I think it's going to be hard to replace Smart from the perspective of what he meant to the team. I would say practically impossible, especially for someone who's coming in as an outsider in the sort of latter half of their career. But I do think it's definitely a key role that they needed to shore up. As much as some of their young players have shown a lot of offensive talent, the defense is really what wins championships, and we saw that with the Celtics of the early 2000s with Kevin Garnett and some of what he was doing. I mean, he was the guy who really locked it down on those finals runs. So definitely important, I think, from that perspective. But when you mention the fallout, this is the way these things work: is that the Bucks make that big trade, then the rest of the league reacts. And so it wasn't too surprising to see the Celtics act so quickly afterward to say, all right, well, you've gotten this guy, so we're going to go ahead and get this guy. And so, where will the 76ers go from here? Where will those other teams in the East that think that they have a realistic shot at contending for a title, what will they do? That's what I think is going to be something that plays out still over these next couple of weeks. I know the season's not far away, but there still is a little bit of time. But it'll be interesting. And, I think the Bucks understand, and I think Giannis has made pretty clear there, their star player, that he wants to win, and their window might be closing. So I think they're about to get into desperation mode, and some of these other teams that have sort of been right there with them, will follow suit. So it's exciting. It's exciting to sort of see big names come together through large trades, especially, and we'll see how it sort of plays out. But I know expectations are pretty high going into the Celtics season with some of the folks that they've added, and you can only just imagine progress will continue with players like Tatum and Brown, who have just shown so much improvement year over year. So it's an exciting time, and I think this basketball season for sure we'll have plenty of storylines, no doubt about it.
Well, Kyle, unfortunately, we're near the end of our time for this episode. Can't wait to see what Compliance Week does in October, and perhaps we can look a little bit down the road at our next episode. But I am Tom Fox.
I'm Kyle Brasseur. Thanks for having me, Tom. Always appreciate it.
This is Tom Fox again. Thank you so much for listening to this episode of From the Editor's Desk. I hope you will join Kyle and I next month, where we go through review Compliance Week's offerings, what's on tap, and talk sports. If you've enjoyed this podcast, I hope you'll subscribe, rate, and review wherever great podcasts are listened to. From the Editor's Desk is a production of the Compliance Podcast Network.